By the time investigators reviewed the footage, the damage had already been done. 2 inmates lay injured, and the official reports did not match what the cameras appeared to show. The allegations centered on California State Prison, Corcoran, a maximum security facility in the state's Central Valley known during the 1990s for housing some of the system's most violent offenders. Corcoran was designed to manage high-risk inmates, including validated gang members and individuals with long disciplinary histories. Security policies emphasized control, strict housing assignments, and rapid response to any sign of conflict. But by the mid-1990s, rumors circulated among defense attorneys and civil rights groups that something deeply troubling was happening inside certain housing units. According to later federal investigations, some correctional officers were accused of placing known rival gang members together in exercise yards, anticipating violence rather than preventing it. These allegations became known publicly as the Gladiator Fight controversy, a phrase that would come to define one of the most serious use-of-force scandals in modern California prison history. The term suggested more than negligence. It implied that fights were not merely failing to be stopped, but were allowed to escalate, sometimes for the purpose of justifying force. In a controlled prison environment, housing decisions are rarely accidental. Inmates are typically separated based on documented rivalries, gang affiliations, and past violent incidents. That raised a critical question. If rival inmates were placed together, was it a breakdown in classification procedures, or something more deliberate? Federal prosecutors later alleged that, in some cases, officers intentionally paired hostile inmates in small exercise yards while armed staff observed from elevated gun posts. When violence erupted, tower officers were authorized to fire warning shots or, if necessary, use lethal force to stop the fight. That authority would become central to the controversy. Between 1989 and 1995, multiple shootings occurred during inmate altercations at Corcoran. Several inmates were shot, and some died as a result of gunfire during yard fights. Official accounts initially framed the shootings as necessary responses to prevent serious bodily harm. Prison administrators maintained that officers acted within policy to restore order. However, defense attorneys representing affected inmates began questioning patterns. They noted repeated incidents where known enemies were placed together under supervision that appeared unusually permissive. Civil rights organizations requested records, seeking yard logs, classification files, and use-of-force reports. What they uncovered prompted federal attention. In 1994, the U.S. Department of Justice launched a criminal investigation into allegations of excessive force and civil rights violations at Corcoran. The investigation examined whether officers had conspired to stage fights or used deadly force without sufficient justification under federal civil rights statutes. If proven, the conduct would not merely represent policy violations. It could constitute criminal deprivation of inmates' constitutional protections under color of law. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and courts have long held that prison officials must take reasonable steps to protect inmates from known risks. Placing hostile inmates together without safeguards, if intentional, could amount to deliberate indifference or worse. That distinction would define the legal battle ahead. As federal investigators interviewed staff and inmates, conflicting narratives emerged. Some officers denied wrongdoing and described chaotic, unpredictable yard environments. Others, according to court records, suggested that certain supervisors encouraged aggressive tactics to assert control over gang populations. The allegations extended beyond shootings. Reports surfaced that some staff referred to violent encounters using language that implied spectacle rather than emergency. But proving intent inside a closed institution is notoriously difficult. Prison environments are inherently volatile, and violence between inmates is not uncommon. Defense attorneys argued that tower officers fired to prevent serious injury or death during fights that escalated rapidly and unpredictably. Prosecutors, however, focused on classification decisions made before the violence began. They asked why documented rivals were cleared for shared yard access. The issue was not simply whether force was used, but whether the situation requiring force had been engineered. In 1998, federal prosecutors indicted several correctional officers, accusing them of civil rights violations related to shootings during inmate fights. The charges marked a rare instance of criminal prosecution against line staff in a state correctional facility. Trials followed, drawing national attention to Corcoran's internal practices. Testimony described specific yard placements and the sequence of gunfire during altercations. Some former inmates testified that fights seemed predictable, even anticipated. They described guards watching from above as tensions escalated below. Correctional officers countered that inmates often manipulated situations, feigning compliance before attacking rivals once gates closed. Jurors were asked to weigh whether officers reasonably perceived imminent danger or whether the circumstances had been deliberately created. In several cases, acquittals followed. Prosecutors struggled to meet the high burden of proving criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. The outcome did not end the controversy. Civil lawsuits continued, and public scrutiny intensified around California's prison oversight systems. Beyond individual trials, broader questions surfaced about institutional culture. How much discretion should line officers have in housing and yard decisions? Internal investigations within the California Department of Corrections examined supervisory practices and reporting procedures at Corcoran. Reforms were proposed, including clearer documentation of enemy concerns and stricter review of use-of-force incidents involving firearms. The scandal also intersected with ongoing debates about gang management strategies in California prisons during the 1990s. At that time, prison officials faced increasing gang consolidation and organized violence, particularly among validated prison gangs. Administrative segregation and security housing units were widely used to isolate suspected gang leaders and reduce coordinated assaults. Some officials argued that aggressive control measures were necessary to maintain order in overcrowded institutions. Critics responded that aggressive measures without accountability could erode constitutional safeguards and invite abuse. The Corcoran allegations became a flashpoint in that broader national conversation about prison oversight and use of force. If stories like this matter to you, subscribing helps us continue examining what happens behind prison walls with documented evidence and verified records. The federal investigation eventually led to policy revisions, though not all proposed criminal charges resulted in convictions. Still, the exposure of internal practices forced California officials to confront how classification and force decisions were monitored. Independent reviews emphasized the importance of transparent reporting and external oversight in high-security facilities. As investigators dug deeper into internal records, patterns began emerging that did not fit neatly into either side's public narrative. Yard logs showed repeated instances where inmates with documented enemy concerns were cleared for shared exercise periods despite prior separation orders. Classification committees were responsible for reviewing compatibility, yet some decisions appeared inconsistent with existing gang validation files and incident histories. That inconsistency became central to federal questioning. Was it administrative oversight, or was pressure being applied to expedite yard rotations in ways that increased risk? Former officials later testified that Corcoran operated under significant strain during the early 1990s. California's prison population had surged, and facilities were managing far more inmates than originally designed to hold. Overcrowding created logistical complications in housing, yard scheduling, and staff deployment. But overcrowding alone did not explain why documented rivals sometimes shared small, enclosed exercise spaces. Federal investigators focused on how enemy lists were maintained and how thoroughly they were consulted before yard releases. In high-security units, even a single miscalculation can escalate quickly. Exercise yards at Corcoran were compact concrete enclosures, often surrounded by high walls with gun posts positioned above. When fights broke out inside those confined spaces, officers had limited non-lethal intervention options from the towers. The standard protocol required officers to issue verbal commands before escalating to warning shots or direct gunfire. Records showed that warning shots were sometimes fired, but in certain incidents, lethal rounds followed quickly afterward. That sequence raised another issue. Were officers truly responding to spontaneous emergencies, or were they anticipating violence from the moment the gates closed? Defense attorneys for the indicted officers argued that prison gangs often exploited yard access to settle scores. They maintained that officers could not predict the exact moment an assault would occur. From that perspective, rapid escalation was framed as an effort to prevent fatal injuries between inmates. But prosecutors highlighted testimony suggesting that some staff informally referred to anticipated fights in advance. Such language, if credible, suggested foreknowledge rather than surprise. Proving foreknowledge, however, required more than anecdote. Federal prosecutors sought to establish patterns through documentation, radio transcripts, and ballistic evidence. They examined how quickly shots were fired after altercations began and whether alternative interventions were feasible. In several cases, juries heard detailed breakdowns of seconds between first contact and gunfire. Those seconds became legally significant. The difference between a necessary response and excessive force can hinge on moments measured in fractions of time. Meanwhile, civil litigation proceeded on a parallel track. Families of inmates who had been shot filed wrongful death and civil rights lawsuits against the state. Those suits required lower standards of proof than criminal trials. In civil court, the focus shifted toward institutional responsibility rather than individual criminal guilt. Depositions exposed internal memos discussing yard procedures and firearm protocols. Some supervisory staff acknowledged that tensions were high and that violence was frequent within certain units. But frequency does not remove constitutional obligations. The Eighth Amendment requires prison officials to protect inmates from known, substantial risks of serious harm. Legal analysts noted that deliberate indifference could exist even without explicit intent to cause injury. The question became whether administrators ignored obvious risks in the way yard assignments were handled. In 1999, after years of investigation, federal prosecutors faced setbacks. Several officers were acquitted, and others saw charges dismissed. The outcomes reflected the difficulty of convincing juries that criminal standards had been met. Yet acquittal did not equate to institutional vindication. Public reports from oversight bodies criticized aspects of Corcoran's internal controls. Recommendations included clearer separation protocols and enhanced documentation before authorizing mixed-yard placements. California's Department of Corrections announced procedural adjustments in response. Additional review layers were introduced for inmates with validated gang rivalries. Firearm policies were also scrutinized. Although lethal force remained authorized to prevent imminent serious injury, documentation standards were tightened. Each discharge of a firearm required more detailed justification and supervisory review. The controversy extended beyond courtroom verdicts. Media coverage amplified public concern about how power was exercised inside closed institutions. Civil rights advocates argued that the scandal illustrated broader vulnerabilities in prison oversight nationwide. Law enforcement representatives countered that prisons cannot function without strong authority to respond decisively to violence. Between those positions lay a difficult balance. Prisons house individuals with documented histories of violence, yet constitutional protections do not disappear at the gate. As the years passed, Corcoran remained operational. But its reputation was permanently shaped by the Gladiator Fight allegations. Former staff members described morale challenges following the federal investigation. Officers expressed frustration at what they viewed as second-guessing of split-second decisions made under pressure. At the same time, some former inmates and advocates maintained that accountability had been incomplete. They argued that systemic incentives, not just individual actions, deserved examination. Oversight mechanisms evolved in California in the years that followed. Independent review processes for use-of-force incidents became more formalized. External audits and internal affairs investigations gained greater prominence. Yet even with reforms, the central tension persisted. How can correctional systems deter inmate violence without crossing constitutional lines? The Corcoran case forced that question into national view. Academic researchers studying prison governance cited the controversy when analyzing use-of-force policy. Legal scholars referenced it in discussions about deliberate indifference and supervisory liability. The scandal's impact reached far beyond a single institution. It contributed to broader scrutiny of how classification systems intersect with force authorization. But one aspect remained especially troubling. If fights were anticipated, why were preventive alternatives not prioritized? Some critics argued that smaller yard groups or staggered release times could have reduced risk. Others responded that operational constraints limited those options in practice. The truth likely involved a combination of administrative strain, institutional culture, and human judgment. What remained undeniable was the number of shootings that had occurred within a relatively short span. Each discharge of a rifle inside a prison yard carried legal and moral weight. The controversy also revealed how little visibility the public has into daily correctional decision-making. Most policies are written in manuals rarely read outside agency walls. Most yard placements occur without external review unless something goes wrong. At Corcoran, something did go wrong. Long after the indictments faded from headlines, the underlying debate continued inside correctional policy circles across California and beyond. Internal reviews concluded that clearer enemy tracking systems were essential to reducing preventable conflicts in maximum security environments. Electronic databases gradually replaced older paper-based enemy lists, reducing the likelihood that critical separation notes would be overlooked during classification reviews. Standardized checklists were introduced before authorizing yard pairings, requiring documented confirmation that no verified hostilities existed between assigned inmates. Supervisory approval processes were expanded, adding layers of review to decisions once handled informally at the unit level. Training protocols also evolved. Correctional officers received updated instruction emphasizing de-escalation principles and clearer thresholds for firearm deployment in confined spaces. Use of force reporting requirements became more detailed, mandating precise timelines, radio transcripts, and ballistic summaries for every discharge. Those administrative adjustments signaled institutional recognition that prior safeguards had been insufficient. Yet structural reform does not erase history. The phrase "Gladiator Fights" remained attached to Corcoran in public memory, shaping how the facility was perceived for years. For incarcerated individuals, reputation matters. It influences trust, compliance, and the willingness to report misconduct through internal grievance channels. For staff, reputation carries professional consequences. Officers at Corcoran reported heightened scrutiny and external oversight that affected daily operations. The controversy also intensified legislative interest in correctional transparency. California lawmakers requested more comprehensive data on inmate injuries and firearm use within state institutions. Public reporting mechanisms expanded gradually, though access to detailed operational data remained limited for security reasons. Balancing transparency with institutional safety became a recurring challenge. Oversight bodies argued that sunlight discourages misconduct. Correctional leaders countered that excessive disclosure could compromise tactical response capabilities. Meanwhile, federal civil rights law continued evolving through court rulings nationwide. Judicial decisions reinforced that deliberate indifference claims require proof that officials knew of and disregarded substantial risks. The Corcoran prosecutions demonstrated how difficult that evidentiary standard can be to meet in criminal court. Criminal liability demands proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Civil liability requires a lower threshold, yet still depends on documented knowledge and avoidable risk. In the aftermath, some civil settlements were reached in related cases. While settlements do not establish criminal guilt, they reflect institutional acknowledgement of litigation risk. Insurance carriers and state budget analysts took notice. Financial exposure from excessive force claims became part of long-term correctional planning considerations. Administrators recognized that litigation costs could rival operational expenses if systemic issues went unaddressed. Nationally, other correctional systems studied the Corcoran controversy. Policy analysts examined how classification decisions intersect with tactical firearm authority. Academic publications referenced the case as an example of structural tension between security and constitutional duty. Within California, reforms extended to data collection. Centralized tracking of use-of-force incidents enabled pattern analysis across institutions rather than isolated facility reviews. Patterns matter in oversight. Repeated similar events can indicate systemic vulnerabilities rather than isolated judgment errors. The broader criminal justice climate also shifted in the years following the controversy. Public skepticism toward institutional secrecy increased, particularly regarding law enforcement accountability. That cultural shift influenced how prison incidents were interpreted in media coverage. Even when policies changed, suspicion lingered. Former inmates who lived through the era described persistent fear during yard releases when rival groups were present. Some correctional staff described the same era as one of heightened gang tension requiring decisive responses. Those competing experiences illustrate why the issue remains complex. Correctional institutions operate in environments where violence is both a risk and a constant operational concern. Yet constitutional boundaries remain fixed regardless of environment. The Eighth Amendment does not relax under pressure. That principle guided federal oversight during the Corcoran investigation and continues shaping prison litigation today. Independent monitors have since evaluated California facilities under various court mandates related to overcrowding and health care. While not directly tied to the Gladiator Fight allegations, those mandates reinforced expectations of systemic accountability. Accountability frameworks now include clearer documentation trails, body-worn camera pilot programs in some jurisdictions, and improved incident reconstruction tools. Technology has altered the evidentiary landscape. High-resolution digital recording reduces ambiguity about sequences of events inside controlled spaces. If a similar pattern of allegations emerged today, investigative review would likely unfold differently. Still, technology alone cannot replace institutional culture. Culture determines whether policies are followed as safeguards or treated as formalities. The Corcoran controversy ultimately became a case study in that distinction. It revealed how discretionary authority, when insufficiently checked, can expose institutions to legal and ethical crisis. It also demonstrated how difficult it is to translate allegations into criminal convictions within complex operational environments. For families affected by the shootings, verdicts did not necessarily provide closure. For correctional officers acquitted in court, public suspicion did not immediately disappear. In many ways, the legacy of the controversy is defined less by courtroom outcomes than by institutional recalibration. Procedures became more explicit. Oversight became more formal. Documentation became more rigorous. But the core question persists in every high-security prison in America. How do institutions prevent inmate violence without inadvertently creating the conditions that justify extreme force? That question has no simple answer. It requires constant adjustment, transparent review, and recognition that authority must remain accountable. Corcoran continues operating today, no longer under the same national spotlight. Yet its history remains embedded in discussions of use-of-force reform and correctional ethics. The Gladiator Fight allegations stand as a reminder that prisons, though closed to the public, are not beyond constitutional reach. They underscore the importance of scrutiny, especially where power is exercised with minimal visibility. In the end, the controversy did not dismantle the institution. It reshaped how its practices were evaluated, and it left a lasting imprint on the national conversation about what justice looks like behind concrete walls. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.